In modern-day thoroughbred racing, there is a rarity of African-American jockeys, but centuries ago, they used to rule the track. Hello, my name is Amanda Thrasher. I am 17 years old, and I am from the Stablemates Forge Club. This is my presentation on African-American jockeys. Throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about the two main African-American jockeys that seem to be the most influential and popular. One, Isaac Murphy, and Milan SaintJean. And we'll be also discussing why they matter and why they're the most influential and what that means to them and to their careers. Taking a brief moment, I would like to talk to you about our local history regarding African American jockeys. In our next county over, we have Saratoga, which is home to the famous racetrack. We also have the National Racing Museum in Saratoga County. And with that, 2 years ago, there was an incident regarding Confederate flags being draped over jockeys. This was because the participants felt that this would be a protest against all forms of slavery. I'd also like to take it on another level that throughout the lawn jockeys of the museum, there's not a lot of diverse jockeys. As you can see, they're all colored to be white. And I think that there's a chance that this can be taken further. And as a result of this, the museum responded with a statement that more lawn jockeys detailing history and significance would be added. And I hope this means that more diverse lawn jockeys will be added. One of the most famous and earliest jockeys is Isaac Murphy. He was probably one of the most successful and popular jockeys of his time. He was born to free black parents in 1861 in Fayette County, Kentucky, and he grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, and began his racing career in 1875. He rode in the Kentucky Derby 11 times, and he was the first to win the Derby crowns in 1890 and 91. He was a three-time winner of the Kentucky Derby in 1889, 90, and 91. He also went on to win the first American Derby in Chicago and continued that for 3 more years. Due to his success and fame, he became one of the highest paid athletes in the U.S. Sadly, his racing career ended when it was uncovered that he had some alcoholic problems, and this really blew up, and a lot of other jockeys took this into their favor and decided to really play it that he could no longer continue his career. But regardless of that, his legacy still continues on. I want to talk about another point that will bring us into our next jockey. There was a time where, or a span of a few years, several decades, where jockeys were not seen in derbies, and there was a real loss of them, and they were rare and pretty scarce. And it wasn't until our next jockey that you can see that they started becoming known and for what they've did. Coming up to Milan SaintJean, he was born in 1972 in Lafayette, Louisiana, and in 2000, he became the first African-American jockey to ride in Kentucky Derby after 79 years, and he placed 7th. And I still think that this is amazing because after all those years, he showed up and he was like, yeah, I'm a jockey and I'm gonna ride. And even though we haven't showed up, my color hasn't showed up in this race, my race hasn't showed up, we're here. He started his profession in Evangeline Downs in 1989 and won his first race as a high school junior. He was a lead jockey at Delta Downs, Lone Star Park, and Kentucky Downs. He was featured in Raising the Roof for Black History Month in the 2000s, which was a black African American documentary about famous athletes. In May 19th, he was injured in his spinal cord during a race which his horse was interfered with, and this left him very injured, and while he hasn't said anything about his retirement, he is no longer riding. In the end, he has won over 2,000 races, and he has earned nearly $47 million, which I think is quite amazing for him. Taking a brief moment, I would like to talk to you about this man, Oliver Loomis. I didn't mention him before just because I wouldn't be talking about as much as I would be talking about the other jockeys. But he was the first jockey to ever win the Kentucky Derby. And for the first 28 years of the Kentucky Derby, African American jockeys have won over 15 out of those 28. So, why do they matter? Why them? So in the very beginning of racing, right after the Emancipation Proclamation had come out, African Americans had that skill to be working in the stables as they did when they worked under owners. And they were rider, grooms, and trainers. And taking that skill to make a job for themselves, they decided to ride in the South Circuit of thoroughbred racing. And while in the North, immigrants from Europe did the Northern Circuit. I would like to talk about why they matter and why I do this presentation and why I chose them. So during the Gilded Age, which was the rapid economic growth in the late 19th century to the early 20th century, racism was really on the rise. We do still see racism to this modern day and throughout history, but this was more significant to African American jockeys, and African Americans in general, while the Jim Crow laws were becoming more and more popular and more enforced. So due to all these societal changes and factors, colored jockeys were forced to leave the tracks in the beginning of the 20th century. And in some cases, white jockeys would actually target black jockeys and make it sure that they didn't win. They would either get in front of them and would not let them pass at all. And white jockeys really threatened owners of the horses that they shouldn't be mounting black jockeys, and they enforced that, like I said, by blocking them out so they couldn't win the race. The owners then realized that they were serious and they did not mount any black jockeys, and that's when we go to the point of that period when there was no black jockeys to be found until the 2000s when Milan SaintJean came up into the Kentucky Derby. And I think that all these men that I talked about are really important to themselves and to their people. When I say people, I mean African Americans, and they were really significant to the history of thoroughbred racing, and I think that's something to be said for, and I think they deserve a lot more recognition as they're one of the founding jockeys of the Kentucky Derby. And thoroughbred racing, to be said, and they did a lot of amazing things. They won a lot of races, and it really defies that race and color doesn't mean anything when it comes to doing a job or doing a career or, in life in general. And it really goes to show that we shouldn't, that racism shouldn't still be in effect. It shouldn't exist to be for any reason, and it shows that, people are the same no matter what they look like, no matter what they do career-wise. So I